Hello, I'm Philip Dodd and welcome to the Arts and Ideas discussion programme from BBC Radio 3, which brings together leading artists, writers and thinkers. If you enjoy what you hear, do subscribe to the Arts and Ideas podcast, and wherever you get your podcasts from, do rate and review us. It'll help other people to find us. He is the most influential public intellectual in the West right now. He is a fascist mystic. Just 2 verdicts on this controversial figure. An interview with him on Channel 4 News found 6 million viewers, and unlike the usual intellectual, he's more likely to be encountered on the internet and on social media than in print. His book, 12 Rules for Life, An Antidote to Chaos, published earlier this year, is only his second in 20 years, even if a bestseller across numerous countries. My guest in extended conversation this evening is Jordan B. Peterson, a Canadian academic and clinical psychologist who initially rose to fame when he refused to use gender-neutral pronouns, the consequence of a Canadian anti-discrimination law. More recently, he's become centre stage in the culture wars, defending the traditional family, the need for men to be tough, hierarchy and much else. Dostoevsky, the Bible, Hobbes and his own experience as parent and clinical psychologist motor his arguments in 12 Rules of Life, which is largely addressed to young men. Set your house in perfect order before you criticise the world. Stand up straight with your shoulders back. Make friends with people who want the best for you. These are just 3 of his rules. Jordan Peterson joins me now. You're clearly involved centrally in the culture wars. Were you drafted into these wars, or were you a volunteer?
I would say a little of column A and a little of column B, but mostly I volunteered.
Why?
Because the government stepped outside of its mandate and dared to bring in legislation compelling speech. And that had never been done in the history of British common law. And they did it in the guise of a false compassion and in ignorance and in willful blindness. They made a big mistake. And so there's no way, once I had read the policies and understood what was happening, that I was going to stand for that, insofar as I had any choice.
It's the case, though, that common courtesy leads us to address people in ways that they feel easy with. You're happy with that as an account?
Sure, and thrilled with common courtesy. But it's a whole different thing when the government uses an ideologically motivated claim of compassion to justify implementing careless, unbelievably careless compelled speech legislation.
But you're not against the state's intervention in all areas of life, are you?
Well, it depends on the areas.
No, but in principle, I mean, there are some.
No.
You're not an Oklahoma guy who wants to go back into the woods and get rid of the state.
No, I'm actually quite a moderate, centrist type of person. So,
okay, listen.
I mean, I'm from Western Canada, and we're a little more on the libertarian end of things, but not in any. I'm a Canadian, you know. Canadian political radicals are just not that common.
Your book is marinated in religious language.
Yes.
Set your house in perfect order before you criticise the world. That's got the cadences of the Bible behind it about setting your house in order. I was brought up an English Methodist. I want to know, what is your religious framework? I've just back from New York, so you're clearly a North American Protestant.
Yes, I think that's very fair to say. That's my background. My family was a member of my mother in particular was a member of the mainstream Protestant church in Canada, which happened to be the United Church. Although I was disenchanted with religious thinking by the time I was about 12 or 13. It's not that there's anything special about that, but I became very much interested in the role that narrative plays in orienting people in life, and delved deep into it when I was studying totalitarianism, and which I did in depth. Well, I have been doing that for 40 years, really. And that led me down to the deepest of stories. And by definition, the deepest of stories are religious. I mean, it's the fact that they're deep that makes them religious, or vice versa. And so I've strived to understand what those stories mean.
Okay, that makes it sound very scholarly. Mm-hmm. It's not with you. It's inside you. It's not you are religious, aren't you?
Well, it would depend to some degree.
No, don't get epistemological on me. Okay, what I'm asking you is, you're a believer now. Of course, what it means to believe is different, but the reason I'm interested in this is your commitment to individual responsibility has a religious history to it.
It has a religious aspect to it, sure. It has a religious layer to it, let's say. And I would say that the battle that I found myself involved in wasn't a political battle or even a psychological battle. As far as I'm concerned, it's actually a theological battle. So because I see what's happening in the universities as the pushback of a fundamentally collectivist viewpoint against the cardinal Western stance that the individual is sovereign. And
hold on there. That's where we begin. There is, of course, Emerson's great essay on self-reliance. Frank Sinatra's My Way. America has the deepest belief in the individual, at least one strand of American thought, but that doesn't exhaust the West. There are lots more communal versions of life. In fact, one of the things I would have said, and I'm not a Christian now, one of the things I would have said about Christianity is it believes in the communal and in the collective. That's why people go to church. Well,
I would say it believes in the proper relationship between the individual and the collective, not that it believes in the collective. And I mean, and I think I'm fully in that tradition, because I think that the way that you want to orient yourself in life is to set yourself up so that you're taking care of yourself properly, but so that you're doing it in a manner that benefits your family and your community, and that all of those levels of organization have to be serving one another, and that they can.
Now, I understand that, and that's a perfectly reasonable position, but it mustn't be conflated with the Western view is the individual is primary, because that's historically not the case.
Well, I don't agree with that. I think that the emphasis on the idea of the logos in the West and the fact that individuals are regarded in some sense as the carriers of that does make the individual primary from a conceptual perspective. Because one of the questions is...
But Catholicism doesn't even believe in that. Catholicism, one of the founding forms of Christianity in the West, that doesn't believe in this wonderful American Protestant view of yours.
Well, why would you say that belief isn't held? Because of the emphasis on the importance of the church?
Because you can only survive, you can only go to heaven through the church. It's communal, it's collective. Let me give you an example. You and I are both old enough to have watched Spartacus, the Stanley Kubrick novel. There's a Stanley Kubrick film. There's a great moment in there when Kirk Douglas stands up and says, "I am Spartacus." And everybody else around him stands up and says, "I am Spartacus." That is the act of a collective communal sense. It's not an individual responsibility. It's, to use an old European term, it's solidarity.
Well, I'm going to stand by my claim. I think that if you distribute the Christian belief systems along a spectrum, you'd see that the Protestants are more individualistic than the Catholics. I'm certainly willing to grant you that. But I still think that the idea that the individual is to be regarded as of paramount importance with regards to such doctrines as the salvation of the individual soul and let's say, the internal value of the soul is still something that puts the individual in a sovereign position conceptually. And so that doesn't eliminate the importance of the collective in the least, because it is also very much about balance. You could say that the kingdom of God is within you and without you, outside of you, at the same time. And I think that's a reasonable way of looking at it, because it's a matter of harmony.
No, but forgive me, but you don't say that. Set your house in perfect order before you criticize the world. You're giving priority to an internal transformation. Now, one response to that is, why can't you do both at the same time? Set your own house in order and set the world's house in order at the same time.
That's a good question. I think it's because
that's not what you say.
No, and it's not something I agree with. I think the reason for that fundamentally is because this is partly because of my training as a social scientist, is that the first thing you want to do is the least amount of harm possible. And if you put your own house in order, the probability that you're going to bring grief to the world is very, very low. Whereas if you start meddling in the function of higher order systems, especially when you don't understand them, the probability that you'll translate your good intentions into proper outcome is very, very low.
Okay, let me give you back a historical sociological example. Let's just imagine you'd have had the opportunity to talk to Martin Luther King, and you'd have said, don't go on those civil rights marches until you sort out your personal ethics. You wouldn't have gone down that route, would you? What Martin Luther King did, and not only Martin Luther King, because you quote Tolstoy, and Tolstoy in War and Peace is endlessly meditating. Does, as it were, Napoleon get pushed across the Rubicon by the troops, or does he lead the troops? These are historiographical arguments. But actually, you can't wait to set your own house in perfect order, because we're dead before that happens. And second, civil rights wouldn't have happened on your principle.
Well, I don't know if it's reasonable to view what might be true for exceptional individuals as something that should be made the common norm. Like what I was objecting to in that chapter were two things, I guess. One was the proclivity of universities to teach 18-year-old and 19-year-old people that their primary obligation is to be an activist for sociological transformation in the world, which I think is a dreadful mistake.
It's a dreadful mistake because they're 18-year-old students, or it's a dreadful mistake?
No, it's a dreadful mistake because they're 18-year-old students. They have more proximal things to attend to, and they don't know anything. They seriously don't know anything. And so...
Yeah, they do know things. Come on, 18-year-olds do know things. You've got children, I've got children. Both of them are older than 18 now. I wouldn't have liked to sit opposite my 18-year-old and tell them they didn't know anything.
Well, they know enough to put certain things immediately in front of them in order and to attend to their education, but they don't know enough to risk experimenting with large-scale transformations of economic systems that they don't understand in the least.
Okay.
No, not that that's the case for many people. And the other problem with the activist ethos, which is partly what I was objecting to, is that it's very easy for your bitterness to manifest itself as the hypothetically altruistic desire for social change. And I think that happens far more often than people are willing to admit. And so partly you have to wonder if you're attempting to change the world, because you don't want to do the changes that are necessary for yourself.
You do increasingly sound to me like a good radical Protestant, but I want to give you another example, which is different. You know, if you'd have said set your house in perfect order before you criticise the world when you're 18 and at universities, it might have been a more defensible thing to say. But let me give you another example. There's a football match where 90-odd people died from Liverpool. The claim at the beginning was they were badly behaved hooligans, and the police blamed these Liverpool supporters for doing this. The mothers, the fathers, the sons, the brothers, the wives got together and became activists. It took them 25 years to demonstrate actually that what the police had claimed was untrue. Now, they were not going for vengeance.
Right.
They were going for justice. And actually, I really read this book carefully.
Yeah, it
and
seems
the word,
that way.
And the word justice is really not much there. The word vengeance, that's why I think you're an old-fashioned Old Testament guy. The word justice is hardly the word. Vengeance is very prominent in the book. Now, I'm telling you that these Hillsborough families were after justice, not after vengeance. They acted collectively. They didn't know enough.
No, they had their personal reasons. It was part of their own destiny, fair enough.
And they were after justice.
Well, and I'm not going to make the case that collective action is never necessary. I mean, and as I said, I wrote the book in some sense as an antidote. The prevailing ethos is that the highest order of being is political activism, and that's especially the case in the universities. And so, now and then things need to be pushed back into their proper position. So it's not like political action or the desire for justice, which I think is a better way of thinking about it, is never justified. Of course it is.
And
but it's also difficult to discriminate it from revenge. So
no, yes and no is the response to that. Vengeance is personal, it's self-interested. Justice is about vindication rather than vindictiveness.
Yeah, right.
And if that's the case, then you can separate out justice from vengeance. And to be frank, there's no reason an 18-year-old, and there were plenty of 18-year-olds amongst these Hillsborough families, shouldn't be active.
Well,
and there's a kind of quietism about you, which actually surprises me.
Well, I don't want to make the case, or to be seen to making the case, that action at some level other than the psychological is never warranted, because obviously that's not the case. But I would say that we have quite self-evidently swung way too far in the opposite direction.
Who's we? Who's we?
The universities, the social sciences, the humanities in particular, women's studies, cultural studies, so these groups that do nothing but produce activists.
Forgive me, I was a professor of literature, so that's simple historical and factual nonsense. I mean, if universities were turning out social activists in very large numbers, it is a fight that's going on. It is a fight in the university, but I suppose what I'm asking...
How long ago were you a professor?
I've been a visiting professor quite recently, until I turned to the wonderful age of 65 when I stopped being a professor. But the point I suppose I'm trying to ask you about, there are injustices in the world. Mm-hmm. And because there are injustices in the world, you may think, and you may in certain ways be right, that the ways in which these social activists operate is not helpful. But by addressing them rather than the problems, you're avoiding the major issues, which are issues of injustice.
Well, it depends on what you think the major issues are. Like, as far as I'm concerned, the major issues are whether or not people have put their houses in order. And like you see the world, apparently, and fair enough, I'm not suggesting that you're wrong. It's not how I look at the world. You know, you, at least in the way that you're expressing it in this argument, is you see large-scale collective injustices and regard it as people's fundamental, what I suppose...
No. Listen, I wouldn't dream to speak for Martin Luther King or even for the Hillsborough survivors. What I'm saying is, historically and in contemporary terms, there are people who've taken other views that can't be reduced to they want vengeance. They want justice. The book doesn't recognise those other positions. The book tends to reduce...
I see very little of the pursuit of justice characterizing the modern university. I see a tremendous amount of the pursuit of vengeance for things that don't even deserve to have vengeance extracted for them.
So give me an example of what doesn't deserve vengeance.
How about the existence of the patriarchy?
But you don't mean now that women have not suffered injustices. In Britain, Virginia Woolf couldn't go to university, or rather she couldn't get a degree. Women have been excluded in all kinds of ways from social situations, have they not?
Yes, but people have been excluded from social situations in all kinds of ways. And I don't like the narrative, the social historical injustice narrative as a way of looking at the world. The way that young people now are taught about the relationships between men and women throughout history is that the fundamental narrative is that men oppressed women throughout the course of history. And then that kind of came to an end when everybody woke up in 1964.
No.
Yeah, really, that's really it.
No, listen, I don't know what it's like in Canadian universities, but that's what I call, and forgive this European reference, that's a kind of Punch and Judy way of seeing it. That is not how universities as a whole operate.
Well, that's how they operate in Canada. We had the biggest scandal in Canadian university history last year when a graduate student was hauled in front of a Maoist inquisition for daring to show a 5-minute video of me discussing issues like this on public television. The universities are in far worse shape. Maybe they're not in such bad shape in the UK as they are in North America, but they're in plenty bad shape in North America.
Forgive me, and I'm sorry you were involved, but that is not the biggest scandal. The biggest scandal will be the number, for instance, of suicides that are prevalent amongst undergraduates. The fact that one academic was hauled up, in my view, inappropriately for doing what was done is not the biggest scandal. You're inflating
It's
things.
not the biggest tragedy. The suicides are a bigger tragedy, but it was certainly the biggest scandal. Canadian universities don't make international news, and that was international news for about 3 months. And the university apologized and set up a free speech commission. It was plenty scandalous, and it was diagnostic as well. It wasn't an aberration. It was precisely what's going on in the Canadian universities.
Okay. So we're back to a situation where what you're proposing is simply restricted to the universities, and not only restricted...
spreading into wider society at a very rapid rate. In fact, the National Science Foundation in the United States is now thinking about imposing gender and ethnicity quotas on the STEM fields in the U.S., which is an absolute catastrophe. I think you're radically underestimating the danger that these collectivist disciplines present to our culture. I really believe that.
No, and I know you do. And what I'm arguing is that's inflating small parochial, and I use the word parochial descriptively, not abusively. It's inflating small parochial arguments, whereas there are bigger arguments, and those bigger arguments are collective. Not because I think they're collective or because I believe in them, but whether it's the Hillsborough people nailing the police or whether it's Martin Luther King on civil rights, those are really changing people. Let me give you another example. You and I were both brought up in provincial places. I was brought up in a mining village that when the mines closed down, it meant that unemployment suddenly became 60%.
Right.
Heroin moved in because heroin dealers know what to do with people who have got little money and they need to get them hooked. Crime rose 20% above the national average. It was the poorest village in Britain. Those are major, major issues of social justice. The arguments that are going on within the university pale, don't they, in relationship to those catastrophes?
Well, sure. I mean, there are truly terrible things going on all over the world.
But shouldn't one address those rather than addressing the social warrior people who strike me as small-scale parochial battles within a small-scale parochial world?
Well, I guess it depends on how you push things out forward into the future. You know, my sense was, well, I told you what my sense was with regards to the Federal Governments Act. It was that, no, the government doesn't get to compel speech. It's not part of the English common law tradition, and it's a line that shouldn't be crossed. So that was my decision. And the reason I decided that was because I thought that the danger of that propagating forward was extremely high. With regards to what's happening in the universities, I think that the universities have already compromised undergraduate education to a degree that's actually probably not restorable, not in the foreseeable future. That they're charging way too much money for the privilege of doing so, and that they are corrupting the rest of society with talk of such things as implicit bias, which is an absolute pseudoscientific scandal.
All right, and you've gone back and you've got angry because I can see this makes you...
That really does irritate me, because I know the IAT literature.
Okay, but it does mean that you've sidestepped the larger inequalities that exist amongst the poor and the rich.
I haven't sidestepped it. I just don't know what to do about it.
Well, then, you're as the English say, an understatement. You're not a stupid man, so put your attention on those things.
I have. I talk about inequality all the time in my public talks.
Okay, but
and
not
in this
in
book as well.
No.
Yeah, I talk about the inequality in chapter 1 when I talk about the downside of hierarchies and Price's law. And Price's law dictates that in a hierarchy, most people will stack up at zero. And that's a terrible thing. And that's the existence for the left, the reason for the existence of the left.
And what should be done about it?
Good question.
No,
there's a new book out by a man named Walter Scheidel called The Great Leveler. And he did an empirical analysis of the relationship between inequality and governments distributed among the ideological spectrum. There's no evidence whatsoever that left-wing governments are any more effective at reducing inequality than right-wing governments. The only thing he saw in his empirical analysis that permanently reduced inequality was war and pestilence. We don't know what to do about it. That doesn't mean it's not a terrible problem. It's clearly a terrible problem. And one of the things I outlined in chapter 1 was the fact that if you happen to be one of the people who stack up at zero in a hierarchy, which is the most common place to be, that's going to be very hard on you psychophysiologically. And I believe that the left has a perfectly valid place in giving the dispossessed in any given hierarchical structure a political voice. And I think they're abandoning that with their concentration on identity politics.
All right, let me tell you why I think you're not doing what you think you're doing. All right, and you analyse briefly Dostoevsky's Notes from the Underground, and you mention that great unnamed narrator who's
just written a new book. He's written many books, but this is the newest one. It's called Enlightenment Now, and it's a New York Times bestseller for 7 weeks. So that's a great accomplishment, and Dr. Pinker has indicated to me that it's doing better than his other books have, and they've also done very well. So that's really something. So Steven Pinker is the Harvard College professor of psychology at Harvard University. He's a 2-time Pulitzer Prize finalist and the winner of many awards for his research, teaching, and books. He's been named one of Time's 100 most influential people and one of Foreign Policy's 100 leading global thinkers. His books include The Stuff of Thought, The Better Angels of Our Nature, The Blank Slate, and The Sense of Style. And so I'm welcoming Dr. Pinker, obviously, and I'd like him to start by telling us about the book itself, and then we'll talk about broader issues and about the other books he's written and that sort of thing.
Well, the book subtitle is The Case for Reason, Science, Humanism, and Progress. And I'll begin with the progress, because that was the epiphany that more than anything inspired the book. I'd written a previous book, The Better Angels of Our Nature, when I was surprised to come across data sets showing that many measures of violence had declined over the course of history. I was stunned to see a graph that showed that rates of homicide from England and other Western European countries from the 1300s to the 20th century, showing a decline of anywhere from 35 to 50 in the chances of getting murdered. When I called attention to this fact in a blog post, I then got correspondence from historians, from international relations scholars, from sociologists saying, you could have mentioned other declines, another decline of violence. And one war scholar showed me that the rate of death in war had plummeted. Another showed me that rates of domestic violence had gone down. Still another that rates of child abuse had gone down. And I realized at the time that there was an important story here that was that had to be told, that these different declines of violence ought to be presented to the world in between a single pair of covers, just because it did seem to be something of a pattern. And as a psychologist, it opened up the challenge of how to explain it. First of all, how to explain the fact that that there is so much violence in human affairs, but also the fact that it can be brought down. Well, I had a similar set of epiphanies that led to the writing of Enlightenment Now, when after Better Angels was published, I started to come across data showing that other aspects of human well-being had improved. The rate of extreme poverty had plummeted by about 50% just in 3 decades, and now stands at less than 10%. Life expectancy has been increasing all over the world, including the poorest parts of the world. The number of kids going to school has increased, including girls. More than 90% of people under the age of 25 on the planet are literate now. We have more leisure time. We're safer. In measure after measure, life has been getting better, and it's not the kind of development that you could learn about reading the papers. Quite the contrary, because journalism covers what goes wrong, not what goes right. You can easily come away with the impression that the world is getting worse and worse, as a kind of statistical illusion, feeding a cognitive bias, and not realize until you looked at data sets how many ways in which life has improved, including measures like war and crime, which one might guess are going in the wrong direction as opposed to the right direction. Now, I combined that, the other motivation for the book was a set of attacks on the application of science to the traditional domains of the humanities, to history, to the arts, to morality, to language. An effort that I think is quite salubrious, the fact that scientific insights are being brought to bear on human affairs, and how could they not, given that